At first, the lion wouldn't eat, wouldn't move, wouldn't look anyone in the eye. But the boy came back each day, sketchpad in hand, never making a sound. Then one day, the lion lifted his head. A week later, he stepped forward, and on the 22nd morning, the impossible happened. He touched the boy's hand, and that was only the beginning of a story no one in Clearwater Ridge would ever forget. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Snow-capped mountains, Wyoming, late winter, overcast skies, light snowfall drifting through the pines. The wind rolled down from the snow-capped mountains like an old hymn, soft, cold, and filled with the kind of silence that only winter understood. Snow lay heavy on the branches of the ponderosa pines, and the skies above were bruised gray, whispering of another storm to come. At the edge of a narrow mountain road, a truck idled in the cold, steam curling from its exhaust like ghostly breath. Inside the vehicle were 3 wildlife officers from the Wyoming Division of Game and Fish. Among them was Ranger Bill Tully, a burly man in his early 50s with deep creases etched into his sun-toughened skin and a voice like gravel. Bill wasn't one for small talk, never had been, but he cared about animals more than he let on. With him was Maya Nguyen, a younger field biologist with sharp eyes and a quiet, careful manner, and Doug Simmons, the rookie, all nerves and fast blinks, still learning when to speak and when to stay silent. They had been called to investigate an abandoned cabin thought to be used for illegal animal trafficking. The tip had come anonymously, just coordinates and a short message. They left something behind. It's still alive. The cabin, when they found it, was barely more than a hunting shack inside. Amidst rusting cages and foul-smelling straw, they found him, curled into a corner like a discarded secret. A lion cub, but not just any cub. Leo was a white lion, no more than 5 months old. His fur, once a brilliant ivory, was now matted with blood and grime. One of his back legs bore the angry red imprint of a snare trap, half-healed and infected. His body was all bone and tremor, but it was his eyes that stopped them, wide, unblinking, and hollow, not wild, but broken. Maya took a slow step forward and whispered, "He's been hurt for a long time." Doug swallowed hard. Is that normal for a lion to look like that? Bill didn't answer. Instead, he took off his heavy flannel jacket and stepped into the cage. Leo didn't move, didn't growl, didn't even flinch. Only when Bill laid the jacket over his frail body did he let out a sound, not a roar, but something closer to a whimper. The Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat 20 miles south in the valley town of Clearwater Ridge, a quiet community hemmed in by trees and snow and secrets. It was there that Dr. Grace Holloway waited. Grace was 42, tall and slender, with strong hands and dark eyes that always looked like they'd just cried, though she rarely did. Her brown hair was streaked with silver not by age, but grief. She wore a green thermal jacket over faded jeans and walked with a steadiness that came from years of working with wounded animals. She was the kind of woman people trusted, even if they didn't know why. 5 years ago, she had lost her daughter, Ava, in a winter car crash on the very road that led to the mountains. Since then, Grace had poured everything she had left into the animals that arrived at her center, broken, wild, forgotten. So, when she opened the back doors of the transport truck and saw the white lion cub curled in Bill's coat, something inside her cracked. "He's just a baby," she murmured. "Dear God." They transferred Leo to the heated medical enclosure. The lights were low, the floor padded with clean straw, and the walls lined with blankets and insulation to mimic the safety of a den. Grace moved slowly, speaking in soft tones as she checked his wound, cleaned the infection, and administered antibiotics through it all. Leo didn't bite, didn't claw, he didn't even lift his head. Grace looked up at Bill, her voice barely more than a whisper. "This one's not just hurt, he's empty." Later that afternoon, the sun slipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snowy yard as another figure entered the scene. Oliver was 11 years old and walked with a quietness that came not from fear, but from familiarity with silence. He had sandy hair, pale skin, and large brown eyes that always seemed to ask questions he couldn't voice. Born deaf, Oliver communicated through sign language and sketchbooks filled with creatures, real and imagined. He had lived with Grace for 2 years since his parents' divorce, a situation no one spoke of in detail. Oliver noticed the new arrival immediately through the window. He watched the still form of the cub inside the enclosure. Something stirred in him. He went to his room, grabbed his sketch pad and a stubby pencil, and tiptoed into the observation room. He sat cross-legged before the glass, not making a sound. Grace, watching from the hallway, didn't interrupt. She just leaned against the wall and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Leo didn't move, Oliver didn't leave. Then, as the light outside faded into the blue-gray of dusk, Leo's head lifted just slightly, just enough. His eyes, dim as winter stars, locked with Oliver's, just for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, something shifted, not healed, not whole, but seen. Grace stepped closer, kneeling beside her nephew. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her hand found his, and they stayed like that, 3 beings held together not by words, but by wounds. The snow outside the Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had turned into a steady drift, blanketing the pines and rooftops of Clearwater Ridge in a quiet hush. It was the kind of Wyoming winter day that made even the wind whisper rather than howl. Inside the center, the world was still, and in that stillness, a boy sat beside a glass wall with nothing but a pencil and an old sketch pad in his hands. Oliver Holloway, 11 years old, barefoot in wool socks, wore a thick navy hoodie too big for his small frame. His brown hair flopped over his forehead, slightly damp from the melting snow he had walked through earlier. He was deaf from birth, his world a muted canvas, and yet he had a presence so calm that even the animals in the center seemed to recognize his rhythm. He didn't need words, nor sound, to understand. His gift was in how he observed. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the observation room, mere feet from the reinforced glass that separated him from Leo, the young white lion. The cub had not moved much in the 2 days since his arrival. At first, he'd hidden his face, coiled like a ghost in straw bedding, trembling when anyone approached. Oliver didn't approach. He didn't try to speak, didn't even knock on the glass. Instead, he pulled out his stubby pencil and began to draw. The first lines were slow, cautious, like the boy was trying not to scare even the image on paper. A curved back, a paw tucked beneath a fragile rib cage, big, uncertain eyes. Leo didn't react, not at first, but he didn't turn away either. Grace Holloway watched from the hallway. Her arms were crossed, fingers curled tightly beneath the sleeves of her fleece-lined jacket. She didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to break whatever invisible tether might be forming between her nephew and the wounded cub. Grace was a woman who believed in patterns. She tracked behaviors in wolves, rhythms in mountain lions, even the restless migrations of birds. But this was something beyond behavior. It was connection. Each morning, Oliver returned to the same spot. He would sit, draw, and wait. He never expected anything. He just offered presence, and after 3 days, Leo began to lift his head when the boy entered. It was subtle, barely a nod, barely a breath. But it was movement, and more importantly, it wasn't fear. By the 5th day, Leo's eyes followed Oliver's hands as they sketched, and then, on the 6th, something shifted. Leo blinked, slowly, as if trying to remember how to focus. His ears, once pinned tightly to his head, twitched forward. His gaze landed on the sketch pad where Oliver had just drawn him, curled up in his straw, surrounded not by a cage, but by trees and sky. Leo did not move toward the glass, but he didn't look away. That same afternoon, the front door of the center opened with a sharp gust of wind and the jingle of a deputy's badge. Deputy Hank Dalton stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He was a tall, broad man with weather-lined features and a jaw set in permanent tension. His sheriff's jacket, thick and brown with a gold star pinned just above his heart, creaked with cold as he walked. Hank had the wary gait of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. Grace met him in the main hallway, her posture already braced for a fight. "Hank," she said, nodding tightly. "Didn't expect you today, I bet," he replied, tugging off his gloves. "Heard some chatter from folks uptown. Word's out you're keeping a lion in here, a dangerous one." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's 5 months old and sedated for infection. Not snarling at schoolchildren. Doesn't matter," Hank replied. "You know how this town works. One rumor about a wild animal in a glass box, and suddenly everyone's thinking Jurassic Park." He didn't smile at his own joke. Neither did she. "I've got protocols. Grace, I need to make sure this place isn't putting anyone at risk. Or you." She hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the hallway. "Fine, come see for yourself." Hank followed her through the facility, past the owls with clipped wings, past the raccoon recovering from a frostbitten paw, and finally to the reinforced observation room inside. Leo lay stretched along the far wall, his body thin but no longer trembling. His head was up, his breath steady, and just outside the glass, Oliver sat silently, pencil in hand, sketchpad open. Hank squinted through the glass. "That your nephew Grace?" nodded. "Oliver, he's deaf. Doesn't seem scared. He's not," Grace said. "He doesn't need sound to feel what matters." Hank folded his arms. "You know, some folks are already saying you've lost your mind, that you're taking in broken animals like their family." Grace's voice was low. "Sometimes, Hank, broken is all we've got." He didn't respond, just watched the boy and the lion. After a moment, Leo lifted his head and looked directly at Oliver, not aggressively, just attentively, as if the boy's stillness had become a language he could almost understand. Hank stepped back. "I'll be coming around more often, just in case." Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. As he turned to leave, the tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. That night, Grace sat at her desk, half focused on a report but mostly staring through the window at the softly falling snow. In the next room, Oliver's lamp still glowed, casting lion silhouettes across his sketchpad. In the darkness of the enclosure, Leo was awake, watching, waiting, but not afraid, not anymore. The morning sky broke pale over Clearwater Ridge, tinged with streaks of rose and silver. A soft layer of frost coated every surface. The branches, the rooftops, the steel gate of the Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Inside, Warmth pulsed gently through the quiet halls, and, in the observation wing, a fragile miracle was about to unfold. Oliver sat where he always did, cross-legged in front of Leo's enclosure, a small piece of pine wood in his lap. The slab had been cut from a fallen branch he'd found behind the center the day before. On it, he had carefully drawn an image with charcoal, a lion, not fierce or snarling, but calm. Lying beneath a sunlit sky, the cub in the drawing had eyes that looked like Leo's. Oliver held the wood gently in both hands and pressed it against the glass, inside the enclosure. Leo lifted his head, the young white lion, now stronger in body but still tender in spirit, stared at the boy with quiet interest. For days, he had watched the sketch pad, the hands, the stillness of the child who never shouted, never moved too fast, never demanded anything from him. But this time, something was different. Oliver tilted his head and tapped the wood softly once against the glass. Leo rose slowly, cautiously, his muscles still weak but steadier than they had been a week ago. He walked tentatively, hesitantly, toward the barrier. For a moment, his reflection met Oliver's. Two sets of brown eyes staring at each other. And then Leo did something no one expected. He extended his nose toward the glass. Oliver, heart pounding, reached into his pocket and pulled out the drawing again, this time folding it and slipping it beneath the small feeding hatch in the corner of the door. Then, he placed the wood carefully inside the same opening and stepped back. Grace, watching from a security monitor in her office, held her breath. Leo padded over to the hatch, sniffing. His nose brushed the wood, then lingered. He blinked slowly, then softly, with a gentleness that seemed almost sacred, pressed his muzzle against the edge where Oliver's fingers had just been. Through the thin opening, Leo touched the boy's skin. Oliver didn't flinch, he didn't cry out. He simply closed his eyes and leaned slightly forward, letting his fingers rest near the wood. Palms up, waiting, and Leo, timid, wounded. Leo did not retreat. He touched his nose to the boy's palm. Grace, in the control room, sank into her chair, tears silently spilling down her cheeks. It was the first touch, the first leap of faith. A silent conversation between two souls that didn't need words. Across town, Sheriff Deputy Hank Dalton stood over a cluttered desk in the back office of the Clearwater Ridge Sheriff's Department. The file before him was thick with images, blurred night vision photos, confiscated camera footage from game trail recorders, maps marked with red pins near Snowcap Ridge. At the center of the web sat a name, Vern Cade. Cade had been a suspected poacher for nearly a decade, slick, charming, with a smile that never reached his cold eyes, in his early 40s. Verney dressed like a country club hunter, waxed canvas jackets, polished boots, silver watch glinting at the wrist. But behind the clean image was a history of illegal exotic animal trade, including rumors of a private compound deep in the forests near the Montana border. The lion cub, Leo, had been microchipped with a foreign cereal, now traced back to a holding pen near one of Cade's known drop zones. This was no coincidence. Hank tapped the file with his pen, jaw tight. "You're back in my state, Cade," he muttered. "And this time, you brought a ghost with you." There was a knock at the door. Hank looked up to see Sheriff Miriam Blake, a stout, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, with gray curls tucked under her wide-brimmed hat. She was known for her calm in storms and her piercing ability to read people like open books. "You working the Holloway case?" she asked. "More than that now?" Hank replied. This lion wasn't just dumped, he was trafficked. Possibly one of several. I think Cade's operating again, near Snowcap. Sheriff Blake nodded. You'll need someone who knows those woods. Hank's eyes flicked up. I already have someone in mind, back at the center. Grace stood outside Leo's enclosure, watching Oliver, who had returned to drawing. The wooden plaque now lay inside the lion's den, untouched but sacred, as if it belonged there. Grace's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots on tile. She turned to find Hank approaching, a manila folder in his hand. She tensed. You here to shut me down? He shook his head. I was wrong. She blinked. Excuse me. Hank looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in years. That cub, he wasn't just dumped. He's connected to Verna Cade. I've seen the microchip records. This is bigger than either of us thought. Grace's face paled. Verna Cade. You're sure? Dead sure? And if he's back near Snowcap, he's not working alone. There was silence between them, thick. Unspoken memories hanging in the space like fog. Grace broke it first. We'll help you in any way we can, but you need to promise me Leo stays safe. Hank nodded slowly. That's not what I'm here to take. In fact, he hesitated. I could use your help. Grace's brow lifted. You want me to join the investigation? Not officially, but you know those woods. You know how these animals move, and he looked toward the observation room. You've got more reason than anyone to protect them. There was a long pause. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I didn't ask you to, he replied. And yet, for the first time in years, their voices carried a rhythm not of conflict, but of memory. They had once loved each other, before loss and distance carved separate paths. Now, fate had dropped a lion between them, a small, silent creature who, unknowingly, was beginning to reconnect what had been broken. The sun filtered through the pine canopy above, casting dappled patches of gold across the snow-softened clearing. The wind moved gently between the trees, whispering through branches like an old spirit stretching after a long slumber. Deep in the woods just outside Clearwater Ridge, the Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had built a makeshift wilderness training pen, remote, safe, and quiet. It was here that Grace Holloway stood, bundled in a forest green parka, her boots sunk slightly into the packed snow as she waited for Leo. She had brought him here not as a final step, but as the beginning of something wilder. The enclosure was large, nearly half an acre of enclosed woodland, with fallen logs, brush piles, and artificial scent trails mimicking prey. No glass walls, no ceilings, just the rustle of trees and the call of wind. Leo stepped forward, slowly at first, then with greater confidence. His white fur shimmered in the winter light, a striking contrast against the darker tones of the forest. His paws sank into fresh powder, leaving delicate impressions behind. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching, and Grace could see it. The shift in him. The fear was no longer the first thing he wore. It had begun to peel away like old bark from the observation blind 10 yards away. Oliver sat with his sketchbook open, watching through a slit in the wooden wall. He had drawn the training pen in its entirety, noting every log, every corner where Leo might hide or pounce. He couldn't give voice to instruction, but his eyes and gestures, now interpreted by Grace through signs and shared glances, guided Leo through each new challenge. Today was different. Today they were introducing movement. Grace had hidden scraps of rabbit meat under piles of straw and left a decoy, a rubber fox painted brown, in the hollow of a log. When Leo found the first piece, He hesitated only briefly before sinking his teeth into it and jerking it free. Grace smiled. That's it. Boy, that's what you're built for. The training continued in intervals, Leo testing his senses, tracking, scenting, reacting. Oliver signaled from the blind, pointing, raising a palm, mimicking the crouch of a predator, and Leo responded more and more with instinct rather than fear. Grace felt the tears prick her eyes again, not from sadness, from awe. Meanwhile, back in Clearwater Ridge, the town council convened at the public hall, a weathered brick building that sat next to the post office and smelled faintly of mothballs and wet coats. News of the lion cub had spread, and it had done what small-town gossip always did: divide. On one side were the skeptics. Farmers worried about livestock, parents worried about safety. A few loud voices who didn't care how the lion came to town. Only that it was here and on the other side. The hopefuls, the teachers who saw value in teaching kids about wildlife, the conservationists who believed in Grace's mission, the quiet ones, like widower Mr. Ellsworth, who had watched her work for a decade and trusted it without question. At the front of the room, Mayor Judith Lang, a woman in her 60s with white cropped hair and a sharp tongue softened by a velvet scarf, called the meeting to order. She had known Grace since they were girls, and while she didn't say it often, she respected her deeply. The room buzzed with tension until a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Hank Dalton stood. The crowd quieted. Even Judith raised an eyebrow. Hank adjusted his collar. Eyes steady. "I came to this center 2 weeks ago ready to shut it down," he began. "I thought keeping a wild lion, any lion, was reckless, but I was wrong." "A few murmurs," he continued. "What I saw wasn't danger. I saw healing, not just in that animal, but in the people around it. Grace Holloway has done more to protect this town than most of us ever will, and she's not endangering anyone. She's doing what we've forgotten how to do. She's giving second chances." Grace wasn't in the room, but word would reach her. It always did. Judith nodded. "Satisfied, let it be recorded. The council will not pursue further restrictions on the center at this time, and we thank Deputy Dalton for his candor." Back in the training enclosure, the afternoon was wearing thin. The sun began to dip low behind the treetops, painting the snow in amber and rose. Grace gave Oliver a small wave to signal the last round of the day, but as she turned back toward Leo, something unexpected happened. Leo had stopped mid-step. His muscles were tensed, ears forward, his nose lifted. Tasting the air, he was no longer following scent trails or reacting to signs. This was different, primal, unscripted. Then, from the deep of his chest, came a sound neither Grace nor Oliver had ever heard from him. A roar. It wasn't loud in the way adult lions roared, but it was powerful nonetheless. It was not a cry of fear or warning. It was a statement, a presence declaring itself. Oliver sat frozen. His pencil slipped from his fingers. Grace's hands trembled around her binoculars. Leo stood in the middle of the forest pen, head raised, tail flicking. That roar wasn't about them. It wasn't for their benefit. It was for himself. "I hear you," Grace whispered, almost reverently. "The forest hears you now." That night, as they loaded Leo gently into the transport crate, Grace placed a new fleece blanket inside, one that smelled of pine, clean straw, and perhaps faintly of Oliver's hand. Leo didn't resist. He simply curled inside, as if understanding he had done something right. Back at the center, while Grace documented the day's training, Hank arrived quietly. He didn't ask for tea or make small talk. He just stood near the door and said, "I spoke at the council today." Grace looked up. "You did. I said what needed to be said, about you, about Leo, about us. Maybe, she smiled faintly. Well, that's unexpected. Yeah, Hank said, running a hand through his hair. It was for me, too. Outside the window, a light wind rustled the trees. But somewhere beyond that, echoing faintly through the canyons, there came a sound, soft, distant, proud. The forest had spoken. The morning of the departure arrived cloaked in mist. Gray tendrils of fog curled around the pine trunks, and the gravel road leading from the Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was slick with melting frost. Inside the barn, the transport crate stood open, resting beside the truck that would carry Leo northward toward the Wild Echoes Sanctuary in Montana. Grace Holloway moved slowly, checking every strap and latch by hand. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those deep, dark wells that had once held years of silence, betrayed something else now. Pride, sorrow, and quiet resolution. She wore a wool flannel over her parka and gloves that didn't match. Her hair was pulled back into a low, messy knot, as if neatness had been the last thing on her mind. Oliver stood nearby, smaller than usual in his thick puffer coat. His brown eyes never left Leo's enclosure. He held something in his hand, a strip of cotton fabric, worn and soft, torn from the inside of an old hoodie he used to wear when he first arrived at Grace's place. It smelled faintly of pine, pencil lead, and him. When Grace turned her back for a moment to load the medical bag, Oliver stepped forward. With a swift, secret movement, he slipped the cloth through the slats of the crate, where it landed beside the fleece blanket. Then he stepped back just as quickly, his hands trembling slightly but his face composed. Leo was already inside the crate. Not because he was forced, but because he had walked in on his own. It had taken Grace 3 days to prepare him, gently, respectfully, never rushing, and Leo had responded with silent trust. Now, lying in the straw, he watched Oliver with the alertness of a creature who had learned to read silence better than sound. When the back of the truck closed, Grace took one last look at the lion she had once found curled in a trembling heap. Now, he lay stretched and strong, his head up, his eyes wide open. The road north was long, winding through vast plateaus and dense forest before climbing into the colder ridges of Montana. Grace drove alone, music off, the hum of the tires the only companion. Every so often, she glanced into the side mirror and imagined she could see Leo's golden eyes reflecting back at her. She arrived at the Wild Echoes Sanctuary just before dusk, nestled in a private preserve within the Bitterroot Mountains. The sanctuary spanned thousands of acres, untamed wilderness monitored only by camera traps and ranger stations. It was run by Dr. Elia Reyes, a tall, soft-spoken biologist in her late 40s with sun-darkened skin, an ever-present beanie, and a voice like still water. Elia had dedicated her life to protecting genetically unique big cats, and her work had earned quiet respect in conservation circles. Elia met Grace at the sanctuary gates. "He's beautiful," she said, peering into the crate as the handlers wheeled it toward the acclimation zone. "And intact, which is rare." Grace managed a smile. "He's more than intact. He's ready." The release area was a valley wrapped in low ridgelines, with thick underbrush, streams, and a roaming population of wild white lions descended from rescued bloodlines. The GPS collar on Leo's neck blinked softly, secure, non-invasive, and programmed to fall away after 6 months. Grace knelt beside the crate one last time. "Through the slats," she whispered. "You were never meant for cages." "Leo, but I'm grateful I got to be your paws in the wild." The handlers unlocked the gate. The crate door creaked open, slowly. At first, nothing. Then, a paw stepped out. followed by another. Leo emerged into the clearing, his fur luminous under the fading Montana light. He didn't bolt, he didn't slink. He stood still, lifting his nose to the wind. Then he turned his head, not quickly, not fearfully. His eyes met Grace's. They held each other's gaze for several seconds, long enough to say what no one could speak. Then, Leo lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. And then he walked. He crossed the meadow. Slow at first, then faster, his gait turning to a lope, then a run into the trees, into the freedom that waited beyond every fence. Grace stood until he vanished. 6 months later, the air in Clearwater Ridge was scented with late summer and pine needles. Grace sat in her office. The blinds opened just enough to let in a stripe of golden light across her desk. On her screen blinked a new data update from Wild Echoes. Leo had established a territory within the sanctuary, over 4 square miles. The GPS log showed him hunting successfully, even roaming near other white lions without aggression. But the latest entry included something new. A trail camera image? Grace clicked it open and stared. In the photo, Leo stood tall on a rock shelf, watching over 2 smaller shapes curled in the brush below him. Cubs. And in the mouth of one, clearly visible, was a tattered piece of white cloth. Oliver entered the room just then, his steps quiet as always. Grace turned the screen toward him. He stared, then, without smiling, without moving, he simply reached out and touched the edge of the screen, and Grace, quiet, strong, once broken, Grace finally exhaled the breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for 6 months. In that image, in that lion cub with a scrap of human cloth between its teeth, was the final echo of everything they had given, of trust, of patience, of love, sometimes. The most powerful miracles don't come in the form of thunder or light. Sometimes they come in the shape of a broken lion finding his voice, or a silent boy who teaches without words. Leo's journey wasn't just about rescue, it was about redemption, healing, and the quiet, relentless love that only God can place in a person's heart when the world gives up on the wounded. God whispers, "I am not done with you yet." In our everyday lives, we may not face lions or deep forests, but we all carry invisible wounds, and like Leo, sometimes all we need is a gentle hand, a patient soul, and the faith to take one step forward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of love and second chances. And type Amen in the comments if you believe that God still works miracles through humans, through animals, and through moments just like this one. May God bless you and everyone you hold dear.